Well, that last point I think is a very important one. Again, I think all of us here would value your advice. From the private sector perspective, what should governments be thinking about doing to lower some of the barriers that would otherwise impede people from taking those riskier investments in nuclear, understanding the upside potential is great, but again, as you note, in a post-Fukushima environment, needing to be very, very sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that it's done safely. What advice do you have for governments?
Well, one piece of quite good news, I feel, is that our ability to do software simulation is dramatically stronger than it's ever been before. In fact, we can take the older designs, put them into strong simulation, and look at hurricanes, volcanoes, tidal waves, whatever type of extreme situation, and understand a lot better the dynamics of what might happen. The combination of the ability to simulate with the ability to do designs that have inherent passive safety, I think is going to lead to a generation of reactors that'll be the safest energy plants that the world has ever built. Now, nuclear, it has its tragedies. Fukushima was truly a tragedy. Its overall record per gigawatt hour, whatever measure you use, is not terrible. By many ways of looking at it, it's already one of the safest. But there's no doubt we need to do better. And so the ideal would be that there'd be a notion of how these extreme events need to be simulated, and so people understand the bar they've got to get over as they're coming up with their breakthrough design.
Well, I think that's a fascinating point. The power of simulation is truly great indeed, and as you know, Bill, it's something that Secretary Chu deeply believes in. We have a modeling and simulation hub for nuclear based in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, but it speaks to a larger issue as well, Bill, and one that you've also spoken to, and that's the need for continued governmental investment in energy research. Many of the technologies that you've mentioned are ones that either have gotten their start or are getting their start as very early stage matters from governments. At this time, where we're facing brutal deficits going forward, how do you think about the need for and the justification for continued government investments in new energy technologies?
Yeah, I've actually been part of a group called the American Energy Innovation Council, where a number of business leaders, Jeff Immelt from General Electric, John Doerr, who's a well-known venture capitalist, and about 5 others have come together to tell the U.S. Congress that we need to about triple the amount we put into energy research. The number is can be looked at different ways, but in terms of really pure research, it's only about 5 or 6 billion, and I think even triple that might not be enough. The benefits to society, whether it's on the environmental front or the economic front, the benefits of having these advances and having them within the next several decades so we can start deployment can't be overstated. I do think governments have spent, how much they've spent on feed-in tariff or the effective cost of RPS standards, that the balance between funding pure R&D versus funding those things is out of whack, that basic research, both in Europe and the United States and Japan, should have gotten a higher share, because the specification for what we need is a very tough one, and just a pure learning curve won't get us there for most of these technologies as they get up to scale. So I think all the governments should look at their energy R&D budget. The amount of tax you need out of the energy sector to fund a really robust R&D program is about a few %. And so it's not a gigantic tax. When people talk about carbon taxation, you need to get up to much higher numbers, and getting consensus on that has been hard. But getting the lower number that would fund the research, I think every country should do it. And I'm disappointed that that hasn't come about. So I think people who take a long-term view need to speak up and get the model of what happened to drive the IT sector and the medical sector, get a bit closer in terms of the amount of money that gets put in. The private piece will complement that, but regulatory visibility, transparency is the other factor that's so important there.
Well, that's fascinating, and I think you make an eloquent case for continued investment by governments in that sector. One of the things interesting about the modeling and simulation aspect that you mentioned before is it plays out across many different energy platforms, whether you're trying to get better carbon capture, whether you're trying to get more efficient nuclear, wind turbine, and so forth. From the perspective of somebody who has been for his whole professional lifetime an innovator, can you think of, outside of advanced computing and modeling and simulation, other technologies, innovations that could have that kind of leveraged multiplier effect across this whole array of energy opportunities that we see before us?
Well, I think the ability to understand materials and discover new materials on a more kind of rational design basis, whether it's a catalyst or composite fiber that has unique properties. I think our understanding, again through scientific advances that often reflect themselves in complex computer codes to try things out, I think people are underestimating how advantageous that's going to be, and so that the rate of innovation with the right regulatory framework, the rate of innovation will kick up. And that's why, as I've seen things like ARPA-E, which is a United States Department of Energy thing, I'm very impressed that they're looking out not just to people doing energy work, but some of these tools on the side, where that comes in and allows you to do a better type of design. And, so I'm an optimist. I see materials advances, simulations, better understanding of the basic scientific phenomena. I think we will get what we need. But then again, sometimes, the barriers make it look like it'll take much longer than would be valuable.
And Bill, that question of barriers brings me to the final topic, and a very good place, I think, to hear from you, because in just a few minutes, those of us here in Warsaw will be looking at very practical issues of how to develop nuclear energy safely, how to develop the infrastructure that we need to support it, where to be making these kinds of investments. What is your advice to those of us gathered here, the 59 nations and observers of the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation? What are the things that we can be doing, thinking about, working on that would facilitate other entrepreneurs and innovators to come in looking for the big play in nuclear, as you've advocated a few minutes ago? What are the things that we can and should be doing from a governmental perspective to make the ground fertile for that kind of participation from the private sector?
Well, I think the spirit of the meeting itself is very important. Historically, a nuclear sector could be developed in the United States or Japan or France, somewhat in isolation. Now, given the incredible capital costs and time involved, innovators are looking at the global market. And so having some level of understanding of what the different national regulators will be looking at, and can you develop an evidence base in one location that applies in another location? Can you mix technologies? A lot of the incentive plans try and label something as just coming from one place, but I think future reactor designs will mix work out of many of the leading countries, certainly the United States, but France, Japan, others like India and China coming in more. And so having a sense that there is a nuclear community that, in terms of safety issues, in terms of how people look at the models, which will be part of the evidence proposed to get regulatory approval, streamline processes around these things. I think that's absolutely crucial. I know when I went out to raise venture money for the nuclear startup I'm involved in, TerraPower, 95% of them just said things take too long in that sector. Now, we were able to convince a few because of the modeling and because of the potential impact, but it's tough. If you compare it to, say, solar or clean coal, the willingness of risk capital to jump in is pretty low, and so we have to really think of having something pretty clear and coherent, and a big challenge to that is it's got to be on a global basis, because that's where you get the market size enough to justify the investments that have to be made.
That's great advice, Bill, and it actually brings me to my last question, because you talked about risk capital. Particularly challenging for the reasons you've said, and I understood your challenge in finding just a few investors. With the length of investment, the length of the payback time, the need for power purchase agreements where they are not always easy to come by for new technologies, the risk. Are there things, again, from a governmental perspective, as you're out there in the market for private capital, for risk capital, that you think we can or should be doing to try to mitigate that risk in some measure so that we could encourage these kinds of investments?
Well, the regulatory thing is always going to jump to the top of the list. That is there, if a reactor design is new and different, is there a regulatory regime that isn't just purely a black and white thing that says either no, you can't make any of those, or yes, you can make as many as you want. Something that, through a series of steps, you can take a new design and have it, assuming it goes through positively, eventually be available on a broad commercial basis. Essentially, the commercial reactor designs that are used worldwide have a lot of similarities. I mean, you can say BWR, LWR are slightly different. I think some of the breakthrough designs, certainly TerraPower's, some of the modular type approaches, they're a little more novel than what regulators have been faced with. And so you've got to, conservatively you think, wow, in a post-Fukushima environment, is there a chance for any of these things where people have looked at things in a new way? And there's every reason to think, both from a safety and economic point of view, that we're smarter today, 2011, than we were 20 years ago or 40 years ago when the reactors that are in the field were actually being put together. What we know about physics, simulation materials, it's different. And so, I don't think we should mind having the passive safety bar set very, very high. But literally, if it could be known, go run through this, I don't think we'll get it to be truly mechanical, but if it could be something where at least as preliminary, you ran it through some simulation test and that at least got you in the door, maybe something concrete like that could be done. So I think there's a very limited capital coming into the space, but the capital will be important. So I've hired young people into TerraPower. They're amazing, brilliant people trained at these universities. And universities, we want them to see that they should keep these programs open, that there's new and exciting jobs out there. So the ecosystem does require some real thinking about a global regulatory environment that is both safe but predictable, so innovators know what they're up against.
Bill, that's great advice. It's, I think, an encouraging and upbeat note for us to conclude our conversation with you. I want to thank you for the thought leadership you've shown in this area, but also for showing people, and not just showing people, but actually taking active steps to work the seam between energy, poverty, and development, both from an educational perspective, an investment perspective, an innovation perspective, and I know we're going to see the results from it. On behalf of the conference organizers here and all of us gathered here in Warsaw for these important deliberations, we thank you very much, wish you safe travels in Africa, and we'll be reporting back.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the chance to participate.